The wind had a voice, and it spoke of endings. It was the kind of cold that arrived behind the eyes and turned thought slow, a physical weight pressing down on Agnes's shoulders. 70 years had settled into her bones, but this winter was different. This one felt personal. Each gust that tore at her threadbare coat felt like a judgment. Beside her, Barnaby, her golden retriever whose coat was the only spot of warmth in the vast, bleached landscape, whined low in his chest. His paws, wrapped in strips of burlap, were clumsy on the hardening crust of snow. They had been walking since the sun was a pale smear in the east, and now it was a memory, swallowed by a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The homestead was gone. Not burned, not destroyed, just no longer hers. Mr. Davies, with his clean hands and his quiet, regretful voice, had held the paper out to her. A deed, a claim, a line drawn on a map by someone 1,000 miles away who had never felt this wind. Thomas had built that cabin. He had died in it. She had thought she would, too. The world had other plans. Now, there was only the snow and the wind and a failing light that promised a night from which there was no waking. Her body was a ledger of dwindling accounts, warmth, strength, hope. All were nearly spent. She stumbled, catching herself against a sheer rock face that rose out of the snowdrifts like a broken tooth. The granite was brutally cold, leaching the last of her heat through her thin gloves. Barnaby pushed his head against her hand, a solid, living anchor. "I know, boy," she whispered, her words snatched away by the gale. Not much farther it was a lie, and they both knew it. There was no farther. There was only here. She slumped against the rock, the fight draining out of her. This was it. A quiet, frozen end. Thomas would be waiting. But Barnaby nudged her again, insistent, then turned his head and sniffed at the rock wall. He pawed at a narrow crevice near the base, a dark line almost invisible against the grey stone. He whined again, a different sound this time. Curious. He pushed his nose into the crack. And then he stopped, perfectly still, his tail giving a single, tentative wag. He looked back at her, his dark eyes wide. Agnes pushed herself upright, her joints screaming in protest. She knelt, her knee sinking into the biting snow, and put her own hand to the crevice. It was impossible. She pulled her hand back, thinking the cold had finally broken her mind. Then she did it again, slowly, deliberately. From the deep, dark crack in the frozen heart of the mountain, a steady current of warm air flowed out to meet her, smelling of dry earth and deep thyme. Agnes worked with the methodical desperation of a person who has been given an impossible second chance. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled with the clasp of the small skinning knife Thomas had always kept home to a razor's edge. She used its tip to chip away at the frozen mud and ice sealing the edges of the crevice. Barnaby watched, his body tense, occasionally digging with his own paws as if to help. The rock around the fissure was loose shale, fractured by seasons of freezing and thawing. Using the handle of the knife as a lever, she pried at a larger, flat stone. It resisted, groaned, then shifted with a grating sound that was swallowed by the wind. The opening was now wide enough for the dog to squeeze through. He vanished into the darkness without hesitation, and a moment later, his muffled, excited bark echoed from within. That was all the invitation she needed. She worked for another hour, her movements fueled by a resurgence of will she hadn't felt in years. Stones were pulled away, stacked neatly to one side, until the opening was the size of a small doorway. She crawled through, her body aching, and emerged from the howling blizzard into a place of profound stillness and impossible warmth. It was not a cave, not merely. It was a chamber, the walls rising to a dark, unseen ceiling. The air was dry and warm, carrying the same clean, mineral scent. A soft, ambient heat radiated from the rock itself. She could feel it through the soles of her worn boots, a gentle, life-giving energy that began to thaw the deep chill in her marrow. She fumbled in her satchel for a match and a candle stub. The small flame flickered to life, pushing back the immense darkness. The chamber was larger than her cabin had been. The floor was mostly level, covered in a fine, dry dust. In the center of the room, a pillar of rock reached toward the ceiling, and around its base, someone had long ago built a fire pit of smooth river stones. There was more. Against the far wall, a stack of wood was piled, ancient and dark, the logs so dry they were nearly petrified. Near it sat a rusted tin cup and a small, leather-bound journal, its cover warped and stiff. Agnes picked it up. The pages were brittle, the ink faded to a ghostly brown. Most of it was illegible, filled with geological notes and drawings of rock strata. But on the last page, 2 initials were carved into the thick paper with the tip of a knife, L, M, and beneath them, a single, unfinished sentence. The heat is a kind of the final word was not there. It simply stopped. She ran her finger over the letters, a connection to a ghost who had found this same impossible sanctuary. Who was LM? What had happened to him? The questions hung in the warm, silent air. She let go of the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The wind still screamed outside, but in here, it was only a distant rumor. She was safe. For now. The first days were a blur of purposeful labor. Survival was a rhythm, a series of tasks that left no room for despair. Agnes's grief for Thomas, a vast and silent ocean within her, was held at bay by the immediate demands of the present. The physical work was a balm, a way to process a sorrow too heavy for words. She didn't weep for what she had lost, instead, she built. She found the source of the heat, a network of tiny fissures in the far wall, from which a gentle steam escaped, smelling faintly of sulfur. Following the largest of these cracks led her to a smaller adjoining chamber, where a pool of water, clear and impossibly warm, bubbled up from the rock. A hot spring, deep in the mountain's core. Clean water. Heat. Shelter. It was a miracle she did not have the energy to question. She spent a full day clearing the main chamber, sweeping the dust of centuries toward the entrance with a makeshift broom of stiff, dry weed she found clinging to the rock face outside. She organized her meager possessions, a single cast iron pot, a wool blanket, the last of her flour and salted pork, and Thomas's old tools. Each object was a memory, a piece of the life that had been stolen from her. As she worked, the face of Mr. Davies swam in her memory. He had not been cruel, not in the way of a bully. His menace was quieter, colder. He had stood in her doorway, the legal papers held carefully in his gloved hands, his gaze sweeping over the home she and Thomas had poured their lives into. "The railroad company holds the title to this parcel," he'd said, his voice maddeningly reasonable. It was an administrative oversight it wasn't acted upon sooner. "We can't have squatters squatter." The word was a branding iron. 40 years she had lived on that land. She had buried her husband in its soil. "You have until the first snow," he'd continued, his eyes devoid of pity. "The company is being generous." She had wanted to scream, to rage, to fight. But she had learned long ago that some forces were like the weather, you could not reason with them. You could only endure. So she had simply nodded, her dignity a thin shield against the ruin he represented. Now, in the warm dark of the cave, that silent rage fueled her. She used Thomas's hammer and chisel to widen the spring's runoff channel, directing the excess water out of the cave through a low point in the rock. She tested the petrified wood in the fire pit. It smoldered with a low, consistent heat, burning more like coal than timber. The cave was becoming a home, shaped by the same resilience that had carried her through a lifetime of hardship. She was a squatter no more. She was a survivor. Weeks passed. A routine settled in, as reliable as the warmth from the stone. The blizzard had blown itself out, leaving behind a world of impossible white and profound silence. Agnes rarely ventured far from the cave entrance, gathering what dry brush the wind exposed and checking the simple snare line she'd set. The traps yielded little, a few scrawny rabbits, but it was enough. Barnaby, who had grown lean, would watch her with an almost human understanding, never straying far. One afternoon, as the low sun cast long blue shadows across the snow, the dog suddenly stood, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Agnes followed his gaze. A figure was moving across the valley floor below, a dark shape against the snow, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who knew the wilderness. He was leading a mule laden with gear. He was a trapper, most likely, or a prospector following the melt. Agnes pulled back into the shadows of the cave entrance, her hand resting on Barnaby's head to quiet him. She was not afraid, but caution was an instinct honed over a lifetime. The man stopped, his head tilted up, scanning the rock face. He couldn't see her, but he must have seen the faint wisp of steam from the cave entrance, a subtle anomaly in the frozen landscape. He adjusted the rifle resting in the crook of his arm and began to make his way up the slope. He moved without hurry, his steps sure-footed. As he drew closer, she saw he was older, his face weathered and bearded, his eyes narrowed against the glare of the snow. He stopped 20 yards from the entrance, not raising his weapon, but not lowering it either. He just stood there, watching. Waiting. Agnes stepped out of the shadows, her posture straight, her hands empty at her sides. She would not show fear. Barnaby stood beside her, silent but rigid. The man's gaze flickered from her to the dog, then to the unnaturally clear patch of ground at the cave's mouth where the geothermal heat melted the snow. He nodded slowly, a gesture of acknowledgement, not friendliness. He didn't speak. After a long moment, he unslung a canvas sack from his shoulder, opened it, and took out 2 large, dressed rabbits. He walked forward another 10 paces, laid them on a flat, snow-free rock, and backed away. He turned without a word and began the slow trek back down the slope toward his mule. Agnes watched him go, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. He had not asked for anything. He had not threatened. He had simply seen a need and met it. In the unforgiving logic of the frontier, it was the most profound statement of respect one stranger could offer another. His name was Saul. He returned 3 days later, just as a new storm was gathering in the north, the sky turning the color of lead. This time, he led the mule all the way up to the cave entrance. He didn't ask for permission, but he waited for it, his eyes meeting hers across the short distance. Agnes gave a single, sharp nod. It was all the invitation he required. He unpacked his mule with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived outdoors, stacking his supplies neatly against the rock wall, well away from her own. He built his own small fire pit near the entrance, using stones he gathered himself, a clear delineation of space. He was a guest, not an intruder. They existed in the warm silence of the cave, 2 solitary creatures brought together by the indifference of the weather. Their conversations were sparse, utilitarian. "Storm will be a bad one," he said, looking at the sky. "Aye," she replied. That was all. Yet, a silent understanding grew between them. He watched her mend a tear in her blanket, his eyes noting the precision of her stitches. She watched him clean his rifle, the methodical way he cared for his tools. They were recognizing in each other the same quiet competence, the same stubborn refusal to be broken by the world. One evening, as the wind howled outside, a terrifying, shrieking chorus, he looked over at the wall where the initials were carved. He had noticed them before but had not commented. "LM," he said, his voice a low rumble. He squinted at the unfinished sentence below it. He grunted, a sound of dismissal or perhaps recognition. "Folks get strange ideas out here," he offered nothing more, retreating back into his silence. But the seed was planted. He knew something. During the worst of the storm, a powerful gust tore at the makeshift hide Agnes had stretched over the entrance, threatening to rip it away. Without a word, Saul was on his feet. He grabbed a heavy log from his own supply and worked with her to brace the opening, their bodies moving in a synchronized effort against the fury of the wind. They spent an hour in the biting cold, securing the entrance, reinforcing it against the storm's assault. When they were finally finished, they retreated back into the warmth, both breathing heavily. He poured her a cup of coffee from the pot simmering on his fire. It was bitter and black, and the most welcome thing she had ever tasted. He had stayed when he could have left. In this place, that choice was everything. The arrival of Mr. Davies was an intrusion of a different kind. The storm had passed, leaving the world encased in a thick shell of ice that glittered under a cold, bright sun. He appeared at the bottom of the slope, not alone this time, but with 2 other men, all of them on horseback, their breath pluming in the frigid air. They did not look like they belonged here. Their coats were too clean, their hats too new. Davies dismounted and walked up the path Saul had cleared, his polished boot slipping slightly on the icy patches. Saul, who had been splitting kindling, straightened up slowly, the axe held loosely in his hand. He did not look threatening, merely present. A fact. Davies stopped a few yards away, his gaze taking in the scene, the reinforced entrance, Saul's mule, the quiet order of the camp. His eyes, small and dark, finally settled on Agnes as she emerged from the cave. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps surprise, crossed his face before being replaced by his customary bland expression. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his tone perfectly level. "I confess, I'm impressed. You're more resourceful than I anticipated." It was not a compliment. "This land," he continued, making a small gesture that encompassed the entire mountain, "is also part of the company's parcel." Section 27. "You're trespassing." "There was a storm," Agnes said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's a cave. It's an unlicensed domicile on company property," Davies countered, the bureaucratic words absurd in this wild place. He glanced at Saul, dismissing him as a vagrant. "I have my directives. The company has been generous, but its patience is not infinite." He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. It looked identical to the first one. "You have until the spring thaw. Once the pass is clear, you will vacate these premises. If you are still here, I will return with the county marshal." He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. The law, land, and social standing were his weapons, far more effective than any gun. He looked from Agnes to Saul, a faint, condescending smile on his lips. "I trust you'll make the sensible choice." He turned and walked back to his horse, his men falling in behind him. The threat was left behind, hanging in the warm air of the cave's entrance like a poison. Saul watched them go, his expression unreadable. He spat on the ground where Davies had stood. "Men like that," he said, his voice rough with contempt, "think they own the wind, too." The quiet harmony of the cave was broken. Davies's threat was a cold stone dropped into a warm pool, the ripples spreading outward. But it did not create fear, it forged resolve. Agnes would not be moved again. This place was hers, claimed not by paper and ink, but by survival. She and Saul began to work, not just to live, but to fortify. Their labor became a silent, shared act of defiance. They didn't speak of Davies, but his presence was the unspoken motivation for every stone they moved, every channel they dug. Together, they tackled the problem of the smoke from their fires, which, however faint, was a beacon. Saul, using his knowledge of geology and air currents, found a natural fissure leading upward deep inside the cave. Using Thomas's chisels and a heavy mallet, they spent days carefully widening it, creating a natural chimney that drew the smoke up through the mountain itself, venting it invisibly hundreds of feet above. They improved the drainage from the hot spring, lining the channel with flat stones to prevent erosion, creating a small, terraced garden just outside the cave mouth where the warm runoff kept the soil from freezing. Agnes planted the few precious seeds she had carried with her, hardy winter greens, a defiant act of faith in the future. In the evenings, they would sit by their separate fires, the silence between them now comfortable, companionable. One night, Saul was staring into the flames, his perpetually gruff expression softened by the firelight. "I had a daughter," he said, the words coming out unexpectedly, as if they had broken free on their own. He didn't look at Agnes. "Haven't seen her in 15 years. She married a man who deals in paper. Lives in a city back east." He fell silent, turning a piece of wood over and over in his calloused hands. He didn't offer any more explanation of the rift, and Agnes knew not to ask. The pain was there, in the set of his shoulders, in the space between his words. He looked over at the wall, at the unfinished sentence left by the cave's first inhabitant. "The heat is a kind of..." He shook his head slowly. "Some men run from warmth," he murmured, more to himself than to her. It was the closest he had ever come to revealing the wound he carried. He was not just speaking of Lachlan Mills. The sky had been a strange, bruised yellow for 2 days. The air grew heavy, the silence unnatural. Even the wind held its breath. Saul, sniffing the air like an animal, had looked at the horizon and delivered his verdict. "It's coming." It wasn't just a storm. It was a realignment of the world. It began not with snow, but with a wind that seemed to come from all directions at once, a physical force that hammered at the rock face. Then the snow came, not as flakes, but as a solid, blinding wall of white. The world beyond the cave entrance ceased to exist. They were sealed in, the roar of the storm a constant, deafening thunder. For 3 days, they did not sleep for more than an hour at a time. The weight of the snow piling up against their reinforced entrance was immense. They could hear the groaning of the rocks, the sharp cracks of ice-laden trees snapping like twigs. The true crisis came on the 3rd night. A low, deep rumble started far above them, growing into a deafening roar that vibrated through the stone floor. Avalanche! A tide of snow, rock, and ice poured down the mountainside, slamming into their shelter. The heavy log brace splintered, and a torrent of snow burst through the hide covering. They worked in the flickering firelight, a desperate, frantic battle against the cold. They used empty supply crates, spare timbers, their own bodies, to hold back the suffocating weight of the snow. It was brutal, exhausting work, their lungs burning, their muscles screaming. They did not speak, communicating only with grunts and gestures, a perfectly synchronized team fighting for their shared home. When the rumbling finally subsided, they were left in a sudden, ringing silence. A wall of packed snow and ice, 6 feet thick, had sealed the entrance completely. They were trapped. But they were alive. In the exhausted quiet that followed, Saul finally spoke of the man who had come before them. "Lachlan Mills," he said, his voice raspy. "Heard the story in a mining camp years ago. Geologist from back east. A genius, they said. He was charting mineral deposits for a railroad survey when he found this place." He stared at the wall. He sent a letter to his wife, told her he was done. Done with offices and cities and men like Davies. He was staying here. Never saw him again. Most figured a bear got him or he just wandered off. But he wasn't lost. He walked away from everything. Guess he never finished this 1 inch. The mystery of L.M. was solved. He hadn't met a tragic end. He had made a choice. Just as she had. The storm broke on the 5th day. The silence it left behind was absolute, a heavy blanket over the world. They were entombed. But the cave was warm, they had water, and their supplies, though dwindling, would last. The feeling was not one of being trapped, but of being protected, sealed away in the warm heart of the mountain. It took them 2 full days of relentless work to dig their way out. The snow was packed as hard as ice. They used the broken axe handle and a cast-iron skillet as shovels, taking turns in the narrow tunnel, pushing the snow back into the main chamber to be melted by the heat. When the first ray of sunlight finally broke through, it was blinding. They emerged into a world remade. The valley below was a smooth, unbroken sea of white. The trees were sculptural ghosts, their branches heavy with snow. The air was so cold and clean it hurt to breathe. They had survived. They stood together at the mouth of their tunnel, blinking in the brilliant light, 2 small, resilient figures in a vast, silent landscape. Agnes looked at the sheer volume of snow, the drifts piled 30 feet high against the cliffs. Mr. Davies and his county marshal would not be coming anytime soon. The company's timetable, she said, her voice dry, might need some adjustment. A strange, cracking sound came from Saul. It was a laugh. A short, rough, unused sound, but it was unmistakably a laugh. He shook his head, a grin splitting his bearded face. Later that day, after they had cleared the entrance properly, Agnes found a piece of charcoal from the fire pit. She walked over to the wall, to the 2 inscriptions. Lachlan Mills had written, "The heat is a kind of," Saul had murmured, "some men run from warmth." She looked at the words, ghosts of the men who had sought refuge here. She did not touch their sentences. Below them, on a clear patch of stone, she carefully wrote 2 words of her own. Her own beginning. I remain. It was a declaration. A promise. This was her place now. She had earned it. The thaw came slowly, then all at once. The world dripped and flowed, the roar of melting snow replacing the silence of winter. Rivulets of water carved new paths down the mountain, and the first green shoots of life pushed their way through the damp earth. The pass would soon be clear. One morning, Saul was packing his mule. He did it with the same quiet efficiency with which he did everything else. He wasn't leaving because of Davies's threat, but because it was his nature to move with the seasons. He was a river, not a stone. Heading north, he said, not looking at her. Heard there's good trapping up in the high country. He finished strapping down his gear and turned to her. He held out a small, heavy object. It was a beautifully crafted hand adze, its steel head gleaming, its handle worn smooth with use. You'll have use for this, he said. It wasn't a gift, it was a tool, a passing on of competence. Saul, she said, the name feeling strange on her tongue after months of silence. Thank you, he just nodded. Keep your snares high, he said. The melt brings the big cats down from the ridges. It was his way of saying, be safe. He led his mule down the now clear path, never looking back. Agnes watched until he was a small speck disappearing into the vast greening valley. The cave felt larger now, emptier. She was alone again, but the solitude felt different. It was not the crushing isolation of loss, but the quiet peace of self-possession. She had faced the worst the world and the weather could throw at her, and she remained. She spent the afternoon in her small, warm earth garden, turning the soil with the new adze. Barnaby lay in a patch of sun, his tail thumping a slow, contented rhythm against the ground. The threat of Mr. Davies still existed, a distant possibility on the horizon. He might come back. He might not. But the fear was gone. Whatever happened, she would face it. This place had taught her that survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about putting down roots, no matter how rocky the soil. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden light over the valley, she went back inside the cave. She stood before the wall, her wall. She looked at the words carved there, a history of resilience. LM's unfinished thought, and her own simple declaration. She reached out and laid her palm flat against the stone beside the words. It was warm, a steady, living heat that seemed to flow right into her. The heat is a kind of memory, she whispered to the quiet dark. The memory of the earth's fire. The memory of a shared struggle. The memory that even after the coldest winter, life endures. And she, Agnes Miller, was alive.